Okay, I'll get started. Hi, everybody. I'm Rebecca Green. I'm the founder of Dear Producer. It's great to see so many of you guys here with us today for this webinar. I haven't covered all that many documentary producers yet for Dear Producer. It's something that I've been expanding on more recently, so I'm very excited to have these amazing producers here with me today. For those of you who are new to Dear Producer, I created the website in 2017 due to a lack of information and education about producing, and because I wanted to help bring the producing community together. The site has grown very quickly, but it's still a volunteer effort run mostly just by me with some help from some of my friends and the wonderful producers like the people that are here today who give their time and knowledge to all of you. So if you find this webinar helpful, you can make a donation if you can on the Dear Producer website, and make sure you also sign up for the newsletter if you're not already. I do have two amazing sponsors, Genuine Article Pictures and Cinereach, whose support has allowed me to continue my work on Dear Producer and who've made these webinars possible. I hosted the first webinar on April 3rd. The replay is on the website if you didn't catch it live. And while a lot has changed in the last 4 weeks, there still are so many unknowns. We have a lot to cover. I'm going to try to focus as much as possible on what producers are dealing with right now in this moment, kind of versus speculating, what the future is going to look like, to try to offer you tangible advice that you can take back with you to the work that you're doing right now. Also yesterday, dictionary.com published an article of 8 pandemic words and phrases that people absolutely never want to hear again, and uncertainty was one of them, which is in the title of this panel. So I apologize for that, and we'll try not to use that word too many times. If you have a question to ask, add it to the Q&A box, not the chat. I won't be paying attention to the chat. I do have a lot prepared. So I'm not sure how many of those I will get to, but I'll be looking at them throughout the conversation. And some of you did send me questions in advance, which I've incorporated. I'm not going to read through everyone's bios. You can find them on the Dear Producer website where you registered, but I'll introduce everybody briefly and then we will dive in. And I also suggest you put in your Zoom in gallery mode, which is at the top right corner of your screen. So it kind of feels like a panel as much as possible. Okay, so introduce everybody. Megan Gilbride. She's not only one of my dear friends, but she is also a 2-time Emmy Award-winning producer. Her film, Dear Mr. Brody, was set to premiere at Tribeca this year, and she is in the thick of putting together financing on new projects. Kellen Quinn produced Time, which premiered at Sundance this year and won Best Director for US Documentary Competition, which was picked up by Amazon. He was fortunate to sell his film before the pandemic hit, but now he's dealing with how to get the film out into the world without festivals or their intended theatrical release. Diane Quon produces for Kellen Quinn Films in Chicago, and she had 2 films that were set to premiere at South by Southwest this year, The Dilemma of Desire and Finding Yin Yang, which was the film that won the Special Jury Award for Breakthrough Voice. So the first half of this, I want to talk about the creative process and also production, with a particular emphasis on doc production. Kellen, I'm going to start with you. I read a lot. There was a Vulture article this week about the race to make the first coronavirus documentary. Matthew Henneman, who directed Cartel Land, is shooting an epic documentary about the crisis, which Alex Gibney is producing. And the article said that there are at least 20 coronavirus documentary projects currently shooting or seeking funding, all with acclaimed filmmakers like Laura Nix, Liz Garbus, David France, Ron Howard, and there's even a Quibi project already in the works. And so the question is, first, our audience is even going to watch that many docs about coronavirus, which I would say no. But that doesn't include all the documentaries that we're already shooting, not about coronavirus, but whose stories are going to now shift into being about coronavirus because you just can't avoid it no matter where you are in the world right now. And so I'm curious to hear from you what you would suggest filmmakers do to navigate stories right now. If your story is not about coronavirus, how do you keep your story on track? Or do you just have to kind of abandon ship? Like, how are you navigating non-coronavirus projects while you're still shooting?
I don't know that there's a sort of single answer to that. I think it's going to vary so much project to project. And maybe to start, thinking about it. For me, I can just mention two projects that I'm involved with, one of which is about a woman truck driver and sort of women truck drivers in the US in general. And there's a sense in which there's like a new relevance to that story, or an added relevance to that story because of the way that we are so reliant on trucking to transport goods across the country. And many of the other themes in the film are going to sort of be put into greater relief: workers' rights, women in the workplace, all of those things, and sort of inequality above all. But I think we're grappling right now with the question of whether it makes sense to kind of use this moment to sort of say, okay, we're pivoting the story, or whether we just sort of take it in stride and see where things are several months down the line. We were going to be shooting likely till the end of the year anyway. And so right now our plan is sort of to be responsive to the situation, but not to think of it as a kind of fundamental shift in the story. And I think we don't know what's going to happen. None of us really know what's going to happen. And it seems sort of important not to be too reactive, especially with sort of docs that even if they're not longitudinal, duration and seeing where things are in 6 months and a year, is really going to be important. So that's the decision we've made for that project for now. Another film that I'm involved with, which is about growing up at the Texas-Mexico border, has been really severely disrupted by the shutdown. Part of what was going to be our plan was to be shooting with high school students through these months, and high school is no longer high school in the way we've known it. And the film is really not about it has a more general approach in a way to the question of adolescence and growing up in that community. And so to suddenly make it about COVID would completely undermine the idea that has been present in the film from the start. And it's a very personal film for the director and her brother, who's also producing. And so with that one, we've decided to, they're sort of staying in touch with the kids that they've been following, but we're not aiming to kind of incorporate that in, because it would just completely shift what the film is. And it doesn't seem appropriate to just sort of say, well, this is this big thing happening in our life and everything has to now be about that. So yeah, I guess a long-winded way of saying I think being sort of attentive and responsive to the situation is important, but also not feeling like everything has to shift because of this massive shift in our lives. We can stay true to our story's original ideas to the extent that we're able to keep working. And I guess probably a good bit of patience is going to be required from a lot of people. And both on a creative level and kind of asking funders, supporters, and other ways to be patient with us. And I can say ITVS, which is our partner on the film at the Mexico border, has been wonderful in that respect. They've really understood how much of a disruption this is, and they're really working with us to figure out how we can continue to make the film, even though kind of the last months of shooting just are no longer viable.
Megan or Diane, anything to add?
I agree with Kellen that it really depends on the story and where you're at. I'm working on a project where we already started shooting, and it's about a father and son and their relationship. So we have a lot of great footage, so we want to, keep that story. But because it's a rebuilding of a relationship, we have to continue to follow it, and that means trying to incorporate what's happening now. So I don't think we're going to shift to make it a COVID film, definitely, but I think we have to address it in a way, especially because the father is in prison. So where we were going to shoot in prison, now we can't. And so we have to address it in some way in the film, but it's not going to change what the film is about.
Mm-hmm. In that sense too, I know a lot of filmmakers, the filmmakers who are shooting right now,
people are switching to giving their subjects cameras, they're shooting Zoom calls, they're doing more audio, they're pulling more archive, they're finding other ways to tell the story. From your perspective, most docs are very, very timely in their stories. And is it, is it better just to capture the story in the moment, whatever means you can, or is that really hurting the creative vision? Or right now, do you kind of just have to throw that out the window in order to get, the moving story? Diane?
I think for us, we need to follow the relation. I mean, I feel like that's what makes this film so special, is this relationship. So we just can't leave this blank. And of course it isn't, the most beautiful thing to do, like a Zoom kind of shooting or something like that. We just have to, I really believe in our director and his creativity, and we brainstorm, for instance, with our composer about, because what's critical to this is him working with one of our subjects, the composer. So we talked about, like, how do we bring them together, but in a different way. So it's continuing to really try to be creative, but I think we can't not include this time period.
And I think, like everybody sort of said this, like it really has to be a project by project basis. Like I think if you have a really clear vision of what it is that you're making going forward, then, I think there's going to be, dare I say, a lot of uncertainty about how to make it. But I think it's this thing. It's like all of us have to be kind of responsive to like what the story is. I mean, it's funny because I think I tend to respond to films that feel like they're evergreen, so they aren't sort of like chasing a news story, in part because, people who have more resources or people who have they're a higher profile, they can kind of also jump on that same newsworthy story and they can go make that happen. And then your thing is sort of like an also ran amongst, the many Corona pieces or the many, whatever pieces. But I'm always looking for a thing that like makes the project evergreen. And so, on a film that I'm working on, like I think there's like, we've experienced a really minimal, gratefully a really minimal amount of disruption, but I think it's this idea of like, it isn't within the kind of vision of our film to include this happening. And I think so long as that continues to be true, we will kind of continue sort of like, we're editing something and, if we get a chance to get any more production, great. But I think primarily it's really about like us kind of sticking to the pure story. And although like I say that about this kind of the concept of the evergreen, like I'll say one of my very favorite.
What do you mean by evergreen? Explain what you mean by evergreen.
Yeah, like it's a film that, even if it's about something that happened, like Tower happened in 1966, we told the story 50 years later. And when we were actually funding that film, people said, why is this not a Texas story? Why is this not, why isn't this like, they didn't see the national value. And Newtown happened while we were making that film. And unfortunately, I think people pivoted and saw the national value. Unfortunately, it has that kind of, a place in the conversation that doesn't feel like it's just in this moment. And so I think, if you're making a movie about emotions, relationships, experiences, those films a film that was 50 years old can totally resonate with you now. Like I think Grey Gardens does not suffer at all from the distance of time. If anything, it's, more relevant, I think. And so you always want to be making films that resonate in that way, where it's like, you can watch, like I think the first time I ever saw the Harvey Milk doc was like 20 years after it came out. It was like so, important to me and so resonant in that moment. And I think we all want to be making those kinds of stories that feel that way.
Kellen, what is your take on kind of all these different forms of needing to cover now versus how you intended, and and really shifting the final product that you thought you were going to make?
Documentaries tend to be filled with uncertainty from the start. I mean, there are, certain approaches where you can minimize that to some extent. If maybe it's a thing that you write a script for and it's just about drawing on a very particular archive, but even there you kind of come up against things that you didn't anticipate. So I don't think this is fundamentally uncharted territory for anybody making nonfiction. You always have to kind of end up responding to something that wasn't quite what you planned. And so I'm sort of hesitant to say everybody should go out and try to cover everything with whatever tools they have, because it might be that it's a really good time to step back and reconsider what you're doing. It might be a time to focus on the edit. It might be a time to rework your pitch materials or your grant application, it's going to depend so much, I think, on each project. So yeah, I mean, not to belabor the idea of patience, but I do think that that is really important when things are so topsy-turvy, for the most part. And then there are obviously sort of stories that it's important for things to continue to be covered in whatever way is possible. And I think perhaps if people aren't quite sure, go with the version of covering things that sort of doesn't fundamentally disrupt whatever processes you had going, to the extent that you can continue them, but don't kind of make a hard turn that sort of says, okay, we have to, everything has to be a Zoom call now, or we have to record every single conversation. You don't need to like overburden yourself with material that might not be relevant at all. I think you would basically need to approach it the way you would with any unexpected turn of events, except for when the story shifts in a way where this moment is sort of fundamental to what you've been exploring, and whatever it's brought has kind of, this might be opening up all sorts of stories in various projects in ways that no one intended, in ways that could be incredible for them from a sort of narrative or character perspective. So
when I think about it from I come mainly from the fiction space, so I've only produced one doc, and I think about everything. I think about like lens finally to distribution, and when you think a doc's slightly different space, but in order to make a film that distributors are interested in and that they are actually going to purchase out of a festival, like they want to see that cinematic quality in your work. And so part of the reason I asked the question is because I worry that filmmakers are all going to just take to Zoom and give their filmmaker, like they're going to lose some artistic credibility in their work visually, which then only hurts the distribution process down the road, which again, you can't always foresee the future. But I think you said it's like finding that balance of making sure that it's just, when essential to do it that way. But I think shifting your entire film like that is going to be challenging later down the road.
Yeah, and it depends what your film looked like and sounded like and felt like
right
prior to this. There's some films where it's not going to be a massive sort of aesthetic shift, and there are other ones where if you suddenly need to be relying on the technologies available now, it might really feel different, and that has to be part of the consideration, and films. I mean, one of the things that astounds me about what Garrett Bradley did in Making Time is that she trusted her instincts when it came to coverage so much, so that she didn't actually shoot all that much. There were these key moments in the lives of the people she was following, and she made aesthetic decisions about how to shoot that, rather than saying, I need to cover it from all angles and make sure I have a massive amount of material to choose from. She like really committed, and in making that commitment, she achieved something that I think is fundamentally stronger and is the film. I mean, that is what makes the film, in a way that would not have been possible if the main consideration was coverage. And so I think that's, but that varies. That Time is a very distinctive film in that sense, and other films you really do need the coverage because you're not exactly sure where things are going, or you have to kind of protect yourself down the line in the edit. So
I agree with Kellen that I'd like to take this time for this film that I was talking about that has a character in prison, taking the time to edit, taking this time since we can't shoot. The director Nadav has done a great job of like going through all the footage, and so that we're more informed when we go out and when we're able to shoot, and just not taking a typical documentary verite where you're shooting for hours and hours and weeks and being just more strategic about what is it that we really need. And I was saying that we need to capture this moment. I'm not saying like months and months of like Zoom, but I think we can't not address it in some way, whether it's a phone call with him, the prisoner, the inmate, and addressing the fact that we can't visit him right now because of the virus. Just to acknowledge that this is happening.
So, I mean, that kind of leads, Megan, I want to talk with you about shooting right now. And, again, the fiction space is all kind of halted, and there's been a lot of presumptions about what's going to happen. You sent me an article last night from that the IDA put out on the director, Carrie, the director of the Enterprise Documentary Fund, wrote that was really quite fascinating. If you haven't read it yet, I suggest it. But she had said in the article, if you conduct field production right now, you are making an ethical, not scientific decision to take risks with your crew and all the individuals you come into contact with in the process, regardless of the precautions you take. And she laid out how documentary filmmaking is much different than journalistic shooting, which I thought was I really thought it was a great piece. And, you know, you and I had a conversation the other night about safety and going back to production and those that are currently shooting, you know, and I've heard doc filmmakers say to me that, you know, they've filmed in war zones and they've been in areas of the world that are so much more dangerous than being outside right now, so they don't feel at risk. But I want to know what you think of that.
And we've talked extensively about this, and it's on everyone's mind. Like already people are like, we're getting antsy. Like we like to be working and we like to be responsive. And I think that is filmmaking as a community. That's filmmaking as like a personality, right? Like that's kind of who we are. But I love, you know, Kellen and Diane, like both, like you said patience, and we all were like nodding, because I think sometimes pause is necessary. And I wrote down like 2 words: people and pause. My husband works in production, but he works in fiction, like on TV shows. And we've been talking about like what would make him feel comfortable, like going back to work. And, you know, when Heather Courtney and I did Where Soldiers Come From, like she went into a war zone. Like I've actually like figured out what kind of insurance coverage you have. And I've said like, you know, if you're getting out of a Humvee and you drop the camera, you're not getting insured for that because you were on a military base. Even though if you drop the camera, like in Michigan, you totally could get that covered. And knowing like what actually is and isn't covered during a war, or like you have to pay hazard pay because there isn't coverage you can actually extend to people if they get injured in a situation like that. I've booked kidnap and extortion insurance. Like we know all kinds of things about like how to cover people in hazardous but defined environments. And, you know, Carrie made reference in the article to like the Ebola outbreak or people filming in places where there's other kinds of outbreaks. But we actually knew in that time when people went to go film what you couldn't do, how you could interact with a patient who had Ebola to like keep yourself safe or to kind of protect yourself. And also, she also references most people are kind of like backed by big news organizations when they go do that. And that's usually very rarely how I think we as independent producers operate. And, you know, we cannot protect you from the coronavirus. Like that's just like, we all know, like we don't know enough right now. We are all in, like, we have to kind of say, this is an unprecedented moment. We don't know what will protect you. We don't know if quarantine will. Like, we don't know if being in a hotel will. We don't know if you wearing gloves and a mask will. We don't know if your subject's wearing a mask will. And I think, you know, so many of us, this is a business of, it's people, right? Like, we're not in it for the money. We're really in it to like tell these stories and work with people. And we protect and care about our crews, and we protect and care about our subjects. And when we do such intimate work like this, people are such a huge part of that equation. And like, I'm just for myself, I'm saying like, I know I can't protect people when they're going out to shoot. And so if I can't kind of define the boundaries of what's safe, I don't think that we can. And I'm super curious, like what, you know, Diane and Kellen, what you guys are feeling about that. But it's just like, we just don't know enough, even the way that we know about a war zone or the way that we know about Ebola. Like, we don't know enough to make it safe. And I think we have to acknowledge that like lack of understanding.
I totally agree. I feel is Carrie Lozano's piece, which was great. We were trying to decide actually whether to shoot. This was a week before even things got closed down in March, and even at that point, we were already dealing with, is it ethical to put our crew in jeopardy ourselves? I have, you know. And we decided to cancel even before the shelter in place. So I think moving forward, it will be hard to have a shoot until we know more, and I'm not sure when that is.
Well, there, you know, there's been other guidelines. You know, Sweden and Denmark put out their guidelines. China is back to shooting. Like, other countries are back to shooting. Most people in the U.S. are not paying attention to some of that. But if you know, are you guys? I guess I don't know what I'm looking for in terms of who tells me I can go back. And I think the hard part is, you know, there are union committees that are starting that are dealing with this, the studios are dealing with, but I think indies are really at risk for not having the support, the resources, and mainly the enforcement, right? Like you, Megan, could tell your crew, don't go out, your director could run out with her camera, right? Like there's it's a different kind of mechanism to pull everyone together on a fiction film than a doc, which is a lot of the times much more on the fly. And so I worry about doc filmmakers in particular, you know, taking these risks and doing this. But, you know, do you have any idea, like what, especially in the doc community, what are you looking for? Who are you looking to tell you? Because the end of the IDA article was that we as the IDA do not feel comfortable right now telling you when and how you can go back to work. And so as a doc community, who are you looking towards to give the go ahead? Or are you as producers really going to take that responsibility on yourself? Or I mean, I guess it's both, because in the end of the day, you are pulling the trigger to go again. Kellen, is there anything that you are thinking about?
If only we had a clear set of reliable and trustworthy guidelines from our government or state governments. That would be the starting point, right? If that existed. Yeah, I don't really have an answer, and I think what Megan and Diane said is absolutely correct. It's an ethical decision ultimately, and I suppose we on the projects that I'm working on, we're not yet at the point where we're actually having to make that call. But I think a big part of it will be not only sort of the public health, you know, whatever guidelines or policies are being put forth by authorities that we can more or less trust, and sort of looking at those, but also trying to feel certain that if something happens, that everybody has sort of fully acknowledged and sort of taken responsibility for their own decision to be involved, and that we've done our best to have protections in place to care for people. And that's obviously also extremely difficult in this country, given how health insurance works and all of that. But I think, yeah, it needs to be sort of like, the doc community has already sort of made good progress in terms of thinking about consent and these power dynamics and all that, but I don't think we have like a set of answers. It's things, probably the most important thing will be more conversations like this, and people sort of sharing and asking questions of each other and challenging each other on certain decisions. And we'll see, you know, what sort of real situations are emerging that help us gain clarity on how best to handle it. It is truly a vexing question.
Well, and I think too, like when you're talking about responsibility, like it's like, even if I felt like there was a place I could pawn my responsibility off on, like that's not how we operate as producers, right? Like that's not us. And, you know, there was like a science writer for the New York Times who was on Fresh Air I listened to, and he was saying, like, when we were even talking about, you know, herd immunity and people sort of taking like calculated risks to get the disease to get better so that they have some kind of immunity, he was saying, like, we don't even know if you're young and healthy, you might get into this crashing space where you can't be cared for, where even like the most robust medical treatment doesn't actually bring you back. And like, I think that's when we're talking about uncertainty. It's like, we don't even know what level of risk we're in. Like we could have all gotten it by now, and we are those lucky people who like don't, you know, who have no problem with it and our systems handle it. Or like we have, you know, our amazing DP or amazing PA who's young and totally healthy, and somehow they get it in a way that's devastating. And I think that's like, I'll be looking to, as Kellen said, like I'll be looking to scientists, I think, as opposed to government entities, until we have some sort of like very clear national public health policy that makes sense. But it's like, you know, I think all of us have been in situations where like something appeared safe or seemed safe in production, and we had to really do like another layer of thinking. And like, it will be on us to continue to do that layer of thinking and sharing with each other on what we're thinking.
And, you know, yeah, everyone's talking about, you know, at least in the fiction space, well, we'll just test everybody beforehand. And a friend of mine has started researching this, and it's, you know, for a mobile testing unit, it's $250 a test. You know, if you're on a fiction film, it was 60 people for 25 days, you're looking at $400,000. A lot of us are making our movies for less than that. Sorry, go ahead.
Also, what I think is really different in this case than other types of risks that we're used to assessing, which is our responsibility to sort of society as a whole. And while our hospitals and healthcare system in general seems ill-equipped to handle the crisis. Like, what are we doing? Like, even if our crew all sort of comes out of it healthy, or no one suffers, like, are we perpetuating the spread of the disease, or is, it's really different, I think, as Megan was saying, than assessing going into a conflict zone or something like that, where you're sort of thinking about a small group of people and your responsibility to them. We also, in this case, have this sort of like greater social responsibility that I don't think we've fully grasped how to handle.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to me too, because doc filmmakers have taken the lead on amplifying social issues in this world, and yet by shooting, you're like, does that contrast to what you're actually doing as a filmmaker? I don't know, but at the same time, there is an importance to capture it. And I'm talking about some of these bigger actual COVID docs, and like thinking about how they're even handling that, where it's just not one person covering it, right? So yeah. Anything else, Megan?
People. We have to be thinking about our people, and that's capital P and lowercase p.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to move on to festivals and distribution, financing, sales, all that good stuff, which is the bulk of questions people ask, but also the most, I think, uncertain of everything. Kellen, why don't we go back to talking about time a little bit? So like I said, it was picked up by Amazon. You had mentioned kind of what the release was going to look like. One of the things with festivals, I think, the sales agents in particular always use the phrase, cut through the noise is what your film has to do, because there's so many films out in the world. And so, how do you do that when you don't, you cut through the noise by having amazing press, and press comes from festivals and word of mouth and impact screening. So how do docs handle this? If you were to have a film that was coming out, and you don't have those mechanisms in place now, what are the conversations happening around your film? And also, you had the film So Late, So Soon that was at True False as well, that you're selling. So explain kind of where you are with those films.
Yeah. The short answer with films that sort of like Time are fortunate enough to already have a distributor and have been bought is that I don't think anybody knows. There are different experiments being undertaken now for how to kind of break through the noise, or also just to have the film seen in a way that's sort of not just dropping it on a platform or putting it up on a transactional platform. And so with Time, we're in the midst of it. I don't think we have any answers for how best to do it. Just there's a clear understanding that there's a lot to be figured out. And certainly we have the great advantage in the case of this film of being, having the reach that Amazon and its platform offers. And that's like massive. And we just feel like so fortunate, but it doesn't answer the other question of how to like make it some part of the culture, how to make sure that people interact with it in the ways that we were hoping when sort of in-person screenings, festivals, the types of events that we would have been doing, kind of community screenings, all of that are not possible, at least in the near term. But then I think we'll be seeing how some of the kind of attempts that are going on now work. There's Neon's release of Spaceship Earth, Matt Wolf's film, which should be really interesting and telling, and it's really I think really bold of them to kind of venture out in that way, and will be beneficial to everybody to learn from. And then what films without that kind of support, with smaller distributors and no distributors, are trying to do. And I don't have a lot of, I'm sort of ignorant about the specifics of most of those plans, but I think it's the best we can say is that it's a time of experimentation and people trying to figure out problems that were already vexing the doc world for a long time. And so maybe some new tools and new kind of approaches will emerge. But it sucks. Like, there's no getting around that. Like, it's not just a rosy kind of time for new things to emerge. And I think with the film So Late, So Soon that you mentioned, we had a really lovely premiere at True False. And then all the other festivals that we were either pursuing or had invitations to aren't happening. And it's very hard to get press coverage for a film like that, for any film for that matter, when there aren't events or festivals to base it around. And not to mention the fact that writers and critics are being furloughed, or, you know, some of them work as freelancers and they're not being hired. So it's just like there are a lot of sort of different factors compounding each other that make it super difficult. And theatrical distribution is itself a whole other topic, but despite all the naysaying around it and all that, it remained a really critical part of the industry, even if it wasn't sort of big releases. Festivals, for sure. Like, we haven't come up with like the right version of what to do without festivals. And I do think that some of the festivals doing stuff now are kind of leading the charge, figuring that out. I think Odwan Arabia, who's the head of IDFA, has been really articulate on some of the questions that festivals need to be thinking about, and sort of warning against like a single solution. I think similar to the question about like what to do with a film right now. Festivals are going to be having to take on that question in ways that are responsive to their stakeholders, their audiences, the filmmakers that would come, the sponsors, the industry. So,
I mean, for me with distribution, what I'm most interested in is I've been having conversations for the last couple of years with distributors and filmmakers about, you know, your film either has theatrical and it has support, right, and money put behind it, or you go to digital and there's no efforts put behind it from distributors, right? It's like there's no in between. And what we're seeing now is these films where distributors were already for theatrical and now they're going digital, but they already put the money behind a theatrical campaign. And so they're gonna see whether that's beneficial or not. Unfortunately, distributors never share numbers with us, so you know we're all not gonna know that. But you know, with the AMC fight with Universal just this week, saying they're not gonna show any Universal films because they said it worked with. I mean, Trolls is not a good reference, but they said, you know, it worked for Trolls by doing it on VOD, and so now they want to cut those windows. And you know, our windows are so tight that I do think that's been one of the hard. You know, one of the things that hurts indie filmmakers the most are these very particular tight windows. But I'm curious to see, maybe that is a positive outcome that comes from all of this, which is that there is more weight put behind digital releases for independent films that otherwise, you know, some don't need to be in a theater, but they still need money put behind them. And right now it's like an all or nothing space. You know, Diane, you had 2 films at South by, so why don't you kind of speak about where you are with those right now?
Yeah, so we had 2 films at South by, and so we still have not had a public screening, at least like Time and your film at True Falls, you were able to put it in front of an audience. So I think you mentioned this, Megan. I really believe the word is patience. You know, as a producer, our first reactions usually is, how do we fix it? You know, we like control and we want to make it better and fix everything. And I just realized there's only so much we can control. And especially now where the answers we need from the people, they don't have the answers too. You know, that when it first happened, especially with South by Southwest, because it was the first festival canceled, we didn't know our other festivals going to be canceled. We didn't know how the press was going to handle it now. Are they going to cover films that were supposed to premiere but didn't? Sales agents didn't know how were buyers going to look. You know, the buyers had to figure out, like, is this going to be something that's just temporary, or is it keep on going? And so that was something for us, is to realize there aren't answers from anybody. And so for me to try to fix something when no one else has the answers, to sit back, pause. The other word was pause, and be patient. And so the things I could control were to, well, first of all, just cancel everything and get our money back on flights and hotels, you know, let our crew know. but then get our teams together. And we've, from the beginning, we just continued to try to touch base weekly, if not, our immediate team daily, but our bigger team, the press, our PR team and sales team, just to touch base every week so that we feel like we're making some kind of progress, so that everyone is still focusing on like how are we going to get this film out? In this case, two different teams, and what do we need to do next? And then slowly, as we get more information, we act upon it. So, for instance, with the festivals, slowly they each got canceled, and then they were trying to figure out, well, some of them decided to postpone, but what will it look like? And in the beginning, we decided not to go, for instance, on some of the online offerings, virtual screenings. But as time has passed, each film has to make their own decision. One of our films, we decided that we will virtually screen at Hot Docs. So it's slowly, as time goes on, we're making decisions best for each film, and hopefully that will give us additional attention. And on top of that, for press, for instance, we didn't know for South by if people would cover it, but slowly we were told by our PR team that people are covering it. So that was something we could control. So we started, we had a great PR team reaching out to others. So I think it's back to like being patient and trying to work on the things we can control. In addition, like we start working on other things like impact, for instance, for the film that's going to be virtual. That's another way to get it out there and talking. If we do stuff on our own and create impact tools that hopefully create a conversation. Now, still, it's all experimental. I mean, I have no idea, like Kellen's saying, if any of this works, and we're thinking about other things like going out internationally and is that where we start in terms of getting more buzz on the international front because of one of the films is international? It's doing things backwards and going international before domestic, just trying and being as creative as possible.
Well, these online festivals are interesting because, sales agents are, the Cinetic and Submarine, like they've been quoted saying they're not endorsing these online festivals. And I think, for the Amazon South by one, only 4 fiction films signed up and only 3 documentary in terms of features. It was mostly shorts and episodic. And I feel like they're kind of doing it wrong. Like, to me, I wish some festivals are doing this, but I wish they would just emulate the festival experience where there's 1 or 2 screenings, it's a set time, but to kind of just let these films out in the world for 10 days, with no expiration in that time period. I worry that for some of these smaller films, you do really lose your premiere VOD window because they do have press behind them that these are out there. So I do think it's really risky in that space. And so,
but each festival is like Kellen was saying, each one is addressing it differently and trying to figure out what's best for their audience. And so sometimes at least for us, we felt like for Hot Docs, for instance, it is only Ontario. It is a limited, more to what you're saying is it's more of a screening experience, just ticket holders or pass holders. So I think, you just have to think about each festival differently and whether it works for your film.
Well, I just saw the YouTube, I don't know anything about the YouTube one, but they just announced their virtual film festival to support the World Health Organization with Sundance and Cannes and Tribeca. And like, my hope is that we're just not giving all our films away for free, because there are limited windows in which you can capitalize on your screenings. And so that one I was just announced, and I don't know anything about yet, but I will dig in deeper right now.
I don't know much about it either, but one thing that I believe is the case is that it's not going to be just new films. It's like Cannes is not even putting any films in there, putting master classes and things like that. So sort of maybe using those brand names and the kind of the publicity angle for a
Yeah.
good cause, I suppose.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
Megan, so you had your film at Tribeca. Where are you in the stage right now?
I mean, it's, totally, it's super in alignment with what Diane was talking about. Like, we're sort of in that patient space. I mean, it's funny, like when it all kind of came down and became clear, and then like, there's not going to be an in-person Tribeca, at least in April, I was like, whatever, I'm the producer who says, like, you have to know what you're going to do with your film. That's not the festival. The festival has one goal, and that's like, and the filmmakers have to make sure that, like, what you're doing independent of whatever programmers pick you or whatever. But the day that our film was supposed to premiere, we did like a Zoom with everybody on the team. And what was great was that folks were supposed to be there in person joined, the folks who couldn't be there in person joined. And it finally hit me. I was like, oh, I'm grieving now for the like in-person experience with this movie that we are not going to have. I mean, Dear Mr. Brody is a movie that's about like a lot of the things that are going on right now, about like what's most important to you and how can you help make the world a better place. Like, that's what the movie is about. And I realized, like, oh, right, we were going to have audiences coming, sitting down, having the cinematic experience, sharing what they were thinking with us getting to interact with them, and we didn't get to do that. And I finally was like, oh, like I'm grieving, right? Like, festivals are, we were all like grown up on festivals. We all love to like see our old friends and like catch up and meet new people. And I think what's great about, like, I think these sort of online versions of festivals is that some of that networking, I think, is still able to happen. And I think that's amazing. But I think in terms of, like, we're looking for a home for the film and we want to have the right home for the movie. And as Diane says, like, nobody kind of knows anything right now. Like, we're all kind of like testing things out, and we don't know, how releases are going to go, or what support you can get for digital, or, what you're losing by not having a theatrical. And I think we're just being patient in that space. Like, we're not necessarily in a hurry to get out there because, like, what's interesting is that I do think primarily the festivals will go on, right? Like, they will continue. And, but for all of us, like when Kellen said, it sucks. Like, we all spent years making a movie, and like, this was the year of release. Like, this was the year of the festival. And so we have to sort of like figure out what we need to do to like take care of that. It's funny, again, I kind of came back to this whole idea of like people, like being in the room with people, like having the festival support, like we're all, I think that's the thing that we all share. And I think if we think about like us as the stakeholders and the audience as the stakeholders, like, what is it we can do? And I don't have an answer. I totally don't. But I think it's like, if we're really led by that, like, guiding star, like, I think that's at least the thing that's going to point us forward in whatever we decide, like, because, it's so uncertain. I hate to say it.
If you had a doc short right now, there's a lot of emerging filmmakers in the short space listening. Would you wait for festivals? Like, if you had one that was done, you're about to finish, like, what would you do with a short right now?
I would not wait, especially since many festivals are much less restrictive when it comes to shorts being online ahead of time. So, but I also wouldn't suggest just putting it online without some plan for how to try to draw attention to it. So whether that's getting in touch with staff at Vimeo, or if you have resources, whether financial or sort of through other networks to kind of promote it, I think you'd really want to do that. But waiting for festivals, I mean, you can be applying to festivals at the same time and see what happens, but I don't see a huge argument to wait for festivals unless you know very specifically that the festival you're dying to premiere at requires that the film not be online ahead of time, and you want to take your chances on that, I guess. I just wanted to add one thing as we're talking about patience. I think it's really important to make clear that it's not about being passive in that time of being patient, but actually being really persistent and patient. And that includes like trying to hold all of these different gatekeepers, for lack of a better word, to account, sort of, and not in a negative way necessarily, but if you did have a premiere at a festival that's not happening, really making sure that you ask the questions of that festival and kind of they need to, they're having a hard time for sure, but they also need to provide answers. They need to be sort of forthcoming with information. If you're working with a sales agent already, the same is true. If you have a publicist, the same is true. And if you don't have those partners in place already, I think there's no reason not to pursue them, you know, to try to keep working on all fronts, and really just be asking questions wherever you possibly can. With one of my projects, I'm doing TFI network meetings this week, and I'm using, you know, we pitched the project, of course, but I'm also using all those conversations as opportunities to understand how different types of companies are dealing with this. And I think that's, as producers, that's one of the most crucial things we can do, is constantly be gathering information through this period.
I think it's a really interesting, well, because like I asked you guys, like, what are you waiting for? Like, who gives the green light? And so I think it's a really interesting thing to say, because one of the things that I hate hearing, which is we all hear, is this is just how it is, Rebecca, this is just how it's done, right? Like you hear that all the time. And so right now, we're all even saying it, like nothing's happening right now, we're on hold, we're all waiting, but at a certain point, we're gonna have to push for answers and to figure things out, and not just kind of keep hearing, well, this is just how it is, because nobody knows how it is right now, but yet the gatekeepers do kind of like to throw out that phrase. Megan?
No, I was gonna say, like, I think that the like you guys being able to do the TFI network, and I know CPH Forum did this, like that's actually, I think, one of the amazing things that's really exciting that's come out of, you know, having to kind of be responsive in this way, is that the festivals that provide, you know, side-by-side forum, like when you're, sometimes it can be distracting, like during a festival. It's like you have so many screenings to go to and you have these meetings to go to, and I think it can be hard to get people's attention. But it's like, you know, that is bridging people internationally. Like it's like you can totally have a buyer from Sweden and a filmmaker in, you know, in Austin and California, like meet together via Zoom. You get that like one-on-one time. I think in a way you can actually get more focused time. And I think like that's like having lost so much of the in-person and the kind of like natural networking and meeting people that is so great at coming out of festivals. Like, I think that's a really exciting development, is realizing how much support can be given towards filmmakers' connection with industry, like even in this space, even in this way. And I think that that's been a really exciting development.
Are you guys, like, what are you seeing from funders? You're all also putting together projects. Are you seeing like money, you know, typical funders shifting money in different spaces, not having money? Like, what is the climate in terms of raising funding?
Well, I know most of the applications that are the typical more adopt grants and funders are continuing. And so that, you know, in terms of utilizing this time, definitely doing a lot of applications for the new projects. But you also see that people are carving out, so they're not taking away those grants, but they're also carving out funding. You get that every day emails of new specific funds for special projects or projects about COVID, or just people who they know if you need additional help at this time. I could see that the community is jumping in that way. But the standard grants, I feel like they're still committed to supporting the funders.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think among other types of funders, it seems to be all over the place. Some are kind of using this moment to dive even more fully into development because there's more that can be done, kind of, you know, you can do more development work without being on the ground in some cases, so that's happening. And then others are really pulling back and saying we need to wait and see. And I suppose a lot of that depends on their own sources of funding and you know, what kinds of risks they're willing to take or able to take.
Yeah, I mainly work in just the equity space. So for people trying to raise equity, it's, you know, people with money are worried about their money right now. These more institutionalized grants, they've been set aside, you know, for that way. We don't know that they'll be there next year is the bigger thing. But I'm seeing a lot of the equity just pause and wait to see how their money, or they're shifting their money to more important causes than a movie, frankly. Right. You know, I'm seeing a lot of too. Maybe the hardest question I'll ask you is, you know, for anybody who, you know, it's May, graduation season is starting, film school students graduating, there's probably several listening, or maybe they just graduated. What do they do? Like, there's nowhere to go be on set as a PA. There's no internships right now. There's no office to be in. Maybe there's some virtual internships, I don't know. But how could they best utilize their time to get into this industry right now?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, like, I think there's the two prong, right? There's sort of just like, I have to pay my bills. And unfortunately, I think that is the harder prong to answer. I think the other prong is like I have made this joke recently, like I have so many people trying to help me in my inbox. I don't even have the bandwidth to like be helped. And it's like, so if you ever had a moment to like, you're not on, Dear Producer's newsletter or like IDA's newsletter, or like make sure that you're getting all of that information, because there is a lot out there, including like the wealth of information that's been put out prior to now. Like if you do have this moment to like sit at home and be studying, like sit at home and read, like there's a lot out there. And I would say the same thing, like sit and watch. Like there's a lot of, movies that came out last year, movies that have been out for a long time. Like I think there's a chance to kind of go back to school in a way that I think could be, well, whatever, people are leaving school. I think that's the hardest thing for them.
Yeah.
But I do think that like people are trying to, reach out to folks and provide, stuff like this where like we can share our experiences. And I think that's again, like another great thing that's kind of coming out of this experience. I mean, I was kind of recently on a call with some other folks where we've been talking about like, how can we provide internships? Like, is there a thing that we can do virtually to continue to like help students coming into the industry and get them engaged? And I know a lot of doc filmmakers, especially who usually there's a lot of overlap with educators, they're thinking about that. And, and so one of the things you might want to do is like connect with your professor friends and say like, is there anyone who's doing a remote edit or still in post-production on a project, and reach out to them and say like, can you connect them to me? And we can find a way to do, whether it's like, a one-off conversation or something more formal, is there a digital, like, is there research I can be doing for you? Can I be trolling through archives? Like, I think there's a lot of things like that at least could provide a way to spend the time. I think the money-making part is a lot more challenging.
I think that's, well, in the same way Kellen said, hold gatekeepers accountable, hold your professors accountable too for helping you make those connections and to fill that time. Yeah. Megan, we've talked a little bit just about, I think for me, at least, thinking about everyone's mental health right now is really on my mind a lot, and just how we're all managing. And, you've talked about how that is already a big, issue in the doc space, and you guys are out in the field dealing with these huge social justice issues, injustices in the world on a daily basis. But now it just seems like everything is just amplified, that all the cracks you guys already saw are now just these gaping holes. And so I'd love for you each just to talk about how you're managing just, your state of mind right now and the emotions that come with everything that's happening right now. Diane, do you want to?
Yeah, I have to say, I'm one of those who works like 24/7 usually, and now I'm trying to make time to just slow down and say, I'm not going to work all these hours, as much as it like is against my way of doing things, just giving me permission to take more downtime. The other thing that's helped me so much is talking to other filmmakers. I'm just so amazed at how generous people are. I'm still, to me, feel very new to the doc space and filmmaking, and I've reached out to folks who I've always wanted to connect with, but never had opportunity. But now, because of this time, just reached out to them, and so many people are willing to just give me tips and both emotionally, mentally, like how to deal with it, but also practical ways of like what else I can do or try to do. And that has meant so much to me, to have this other network of folks, just generous filmmakers. And even like the team, we just had like a team meeting this morning for Funny, and the people, I think they give me like inspiration and help me mentally. No one is like impatient. Everyone is just working together to get work.
Yeah. Kellen?
I think I'm having, a very similar experience to what Diane just described. Both trying to consciously make more time for things that aren't work, and to sleep more. That's very helpful. And I've also sort of made a conscious effort to like really control my news intake, so that I think I think for some people, certainly the case for me, kind of putting myself, like kind of just being flooded with news that doesn't feel like you can turn it into actual meaningful knowledge or action, just has a really detrimental effect. And I have been extremely busy with work through this period, so I'm kind of wanting to conserve my energy that's not for work, for other things. It's not just sort of like the bleakness of the current situation. And so, yeah, finding the right way to do that, but also not to be kind of disconnected from the world and ignorant of what's going on is something I've been working at. And it's helpful to kind of just limit, to be sort of intentional and conscientious about how I'm going about engaging with the news and what's in the information from the outside world.
Yeah. Megan?
I mean, yeah, to echo what everybody said, like I feel so grateful to work with the teams I work with, and because our work is intimate and we're all kind of going through our own version of this, everybody's really like mindful of each other. And I just feel so grateful again to be working with such amazing teams who, have us first, as much as we're working together on our projects, and not being passive as much as we're sort of like continuing to figure out like what do we want to be doing. I work with the DPA. I think also the Documentary Producers Alliance has been a great resource for members to just like open up the conversation about mental health and about that space. I think that having people just kind of like talk through what they're going through and sharing with each other, that's been a really important way to kind of like feel really connected to what's happening to kind of a variety of different people, but also sort of be able to sort of like share and give back. But the pause part actually has been really interesting for me. Like I have a 5-year-old at home, and there's like an element of my brain that's like, I also want to work as much as possible. And so it's like drop them off at school, and that's like, we go. And then it's like pick them up at school, and then it's like try and shift gears or like sneak something in after bedtime. And that wasn't really working for me. Like at the beginning when he was home all the time, like I was like, he's home and I have an amazing partner. My husband's, a great solo parent, but like, I think it took them being home like full time for me to realize how much I was giving over to work and how I really needed to, again, kind of evaluate the balance. It was really a struggle for me, and I had to kind of scale back things I was working on. But what's interesting to me is like how that might become a through line when things, if there's a normal that comes on the other side of this, like how those things might, how this time is going to inform that. It's been really interesting to me. So, no lack of passion of the things I'm working on, but really having to make more choices about my time. And also like just be patient with myself about succeeding at that sometimes and just utterly failing sometimes too.
You're not failing. And that's great. Is there anything that we didn't cover that you guys wanted to say or talk about? I feel like that's a good place to kind of wrap up, unless I missed something.
Somebody posted a question in the Q&A that I don't know that I can really speak to, but I think is a really good
Sure, go for it.
You raised, which is we've been talking about kind of festivals and distribution, but the question of how to get films to communities that don't have access to technology, and we tend to really rely on a kind of elite set of viewers to make our films resonate, and sort of impact campaigns and all of that are having to reassess how they work too. So I definitely don't have an answer to that. I haven't and have not had to deal with that, but it is something we're going to be thinking about with time, because the protagonist wants to do a set of screenings among her communities, and that's a really essential part of what the film can do and should do. And yeah, we don't know how we're going to go about it yet. So I don't know if Diane or Megan either of you have any thoughts on that, but it seemed worth raising.
I'm with you. Like I don't have an answer. I was on another call where a filmmaker kind of talked through a thing that he was doing with, I think it was like a filmmaking program specifically to teach like youths how to make films, and they kind of pivoted they'd done some really intimate, great sharing with the community that they were working with on the filmmaking side. And I don't know, just you saying that makes me think like it's time for somebody to step up for a good grant that's specifically to like, what are the technological pieces that are missing? Because I think that like impact has always sort of filled in the space that was missing there, but sort of between like indie art houses that serve a certain kind of audience, but that are also telling stories where like maybe there's a difference between the community in the story and the community that's at the theater. And impact is sort of, I think, helped to kind of fill that gap. But it sounds like, you know, as we know, like this is just really like elucidated the cracks in our society and how different people's everyday lives are, and whether they have internet access or they have a Zoom account, things like that. And it's clear that, you know, maybe there's some exciting ground we can break in terms of like bridging some of those technological gaps to create the spaces that we lost by not being able to gather in libraries and community centers for right now.
And it's what's happening in schools, right? Like my sister teaches in Phoenix, and not every school, not every student can work from home and has the access for it. So I think also maybe paying attention to what the school systems are doing, maybe who's supporting that kind of transition for them is an interesting place to look to. Diane, anything to add?
I was just say, I'm just making a note that, you know, it would be good to reach out to some of these community organizations that we're thinking of trying to be part of, and seeing, you know, brainstorming with them. What could we do that's helpful for them?
Well, and like you said, now is a good time to pause and think about the holes that we all have and use the time to start addressing them. And that, yeah, it's definitely an interesting one. Well, for me, the takeaways, I think we have people, patience, and persistence, which I think is pretty great takeaway from this panel. And so I want to, you know, thank you guys all for your time. If the audience could clap on Zoom, I'm sure they would all be clapping for you. And yeah, just, you know, everyone take care and stay safe. And thank you guys again for all your knowledge and for having such a candid conversation.
Thank you. Thanks, Rebecca, for all you do.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks to everybody who's watching.
Take care.